And now, to introduce today's distinguished speaker, please welcome the equally distinguished and poetic president of Seattle University, Dr. Phil Eaton.
On behalf of all of my friends and colleagues in higher education across this city and across the region, I would love to add my thanks to Raj for your service, for all that you've done for our schools and for our community, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day in your honor. It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. John Medina as our speaker for today. He will be speaking on early childhood education, and I encourage you to buckle up. We are all in for a delightful ride, and I guarantee this ride's going to lead somewhere by the time he is finished, someplace that will be new and helpful for us on this subject. Dr. Medina leads the Brain Center for Applied Learning Research at Seattle Pacific University. The center grew out of John's conviction that brain scientists know a lot about how the brain works and how the brain does learning. But on the other hand, professional educators know a lot about how to do the business of education. But the point of the center is that those two groups do not always talk to one another. So our dream is for the Brain Center that we could bridge this gap. And so John, with his extraordinary gifts, is working collaboratively with our folks in education, psychology, physics, and business to conduct what I believe is truly cutting-edge research. We believe this work really has a chance to change the way we do school. John is trained in developmental molecular biology. He has been on the faculty of the School of Medicine at the University of Washington and was the founding visionary behind Talaris Research Institute here in Seattle. He's constantly consulting and speaking in places like Boeing, where, by the way, he helped to make the cockpit more brain-friendly, the Seattle Zoo, the schools, businesses, and national press and radio. I warn you now that John's brain moves with the speed of light, and his verbal output is not far behind that. But I also tell you, as one writer put it, his heart is as big as his brain. John's insights into the workings of the human brain are profoundly helpful. His knowledge is precise and focused and encyclopedic, as you will hear. But his research is always aimed, it seems to me, at the big overriding notion that all of God's children ought to have a chance to flourish. This is the kind of man we will hear today. Please welcome with me Dr. John Medina.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Phil, and it's a pleasure to be here. As Phil stated, I have been asked to speak about early childhood education and brain development, part of a larger conversation about what, if anything, brain science might have to say to the world of education. My first response to that task might seem surprising. I speak several dialects of brain science, but I don't think brain science, whatever dialect you choose, has very much to say to the world of education at all. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Have a nice day. The estrangement is so large that we can sometimes use the same words, but not have the same meanings, which can create a lot of misconceptions about what we know about how brains work and what they don't. And that goes from things like the Mozart effect all the way on up to left brain, right brain interactions. Sort of reminds me of I'm told that this is a story that's taught in MBA classes these days. It's about, how many of you own an Electrolux vacuum cleaners? Anybody? Several of you do? Apparently it's a privately held Finnish company, Electrolux, that makes vacuum cleaners, and a number of years ago, they wanted to get onto and penetrate into the North American market. Unfortunately, and they created a marketing campaign to do it, unfortunately, they did not have any Americans on staff. All they had were a bunch of people who spoke English. So they had a common vocabulary with different meanings, and they created a marketing slogan which had to be pulled 96 hours after it was deployed because it was embarrassing. Here's the slogan: if it sucks, it must be an Electrolux. Now, I don't mean to sound pessimistic. Brain science is maturing. I don't think it's at a point yet where we can be prescriptive to classrooms. If brain scientists and education scientists ever got together to do research, however, we might someday become prescriptive. There are enough things we know about how the brain processes information to create research projects. Investigative nuclei for brain and education researchers to do if they ever sat down in a classroom and did a sustained series of experiments. And in this talk, I'd like to give you 3 examples of such research nuclei. 3 things we know about how the brain processes information that could, were responsible brain scientists and responsible education scientists ever to get together inside a classroom and start to do experiments. I will give 1 example about what we know about something from infants, 1 from toddlers and 5- and 6-year-olds, and if there's time, some of the things we know about the brains in the early elementary years. So, number 1, the first, it involves language acquisition. We know that the brain is best at learning language in the early years. If you want to learn a foreign language, learn it early. Just how early, nobody knew until Patricia Kuhl came along a number of years ago now and published a very powerful paper in Science which talked about this fact. She was able to discover that a preverbal infant, 6 months of age, can discriminate between every phoneme, that's the language, the sounds of a language, every phoneme of every language that has ever been invented. At 6 months of age, it is so universal, she literally calls them citizens of the world. A native Japanese speaker can, at 6 months of age, discriminate between rake and lake. The paper goes on to say something even more powerful, though, because at 12 months of age, all of that nice egalitarianism goes away. At 12 months of age, the baby now can only discriminate between the sounds, the phonemes, that he or she has been exposed to in that 6 to 12 month window. The window slams shut at 12 months of age, and quite literally, a native Japanese speaker who could distinguish between rake and lake at 6 months of age, if they have not heard that Germanic sound in that 6 month period, R and L, cannot distinguish between R and L at 12 months and will never again in their natural lives. Quite literally, Henry Kissinger doesn't think he speaks with an accent. Can't hear it. But it's not just phoneme acquisition. Grammatical organization, sentence construction, vocabulary acquisition, all come online in their most efficient forms way before puberty. In fact, in its most efficient form, before the 1st grade. So, I have a question to ask you. When do we start teaching foreign languages in this country on average? According to the NCES from the U.S. Department of Education, a survey that they commissioned in 2005, the answer is junior high and high school, 10 years after the developmental train has left the station. All of a sudden, we have a research project for brain scientists and education scientists to do. From learning Mandarin to learning Arabic, the need for learning foreign languages has never been greater in this country. Would it help if we began those language programs before the 1st grade? Because brain scientists and education scientists don't get together very often, nobody knows. But if they did, what they come up with might engage the world of education outright, if not, forgive me, turn it on its head. Example number 2, moving from infants to toddlers, even to pre-elementary 5- and 6-year-olds. Here's another thing we know about how brains work. Toddlers are natural explorers and are powerful improvisatory thinkers based on pieces of information that they deploy in a hypothesis testing strategy. We'll unpack that a little bit. This was brought home to me once by our former marketing executive at Talaris Research Institute. Cindy Pendergraft was her name. She sent me a list of quotes from the toddler and post-toddler crowd, some of whom would be coming into Talaris and some of whom she actually got. She found this on the net. It was a precocious group of kids who were asked what love was, and their answers were posted on a website somewhere. From little Carl, age 6, this is what Carl thinks love is, and it actually describes, I think, a little bit about this interesting exploratory ability of human brains. Love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. From Mark, age 5, love is when mommy sees daddy on the toilet and she doesn't think it's gross. And this one is really quite lovely. I don't know that it's very funny, but it's from Karen, age 6. When you love somebody, your eyelashes go up and down and little stars come out of you. Isn't that lovely? Toddlers are natural explorers. The brain rule is this: infants and toddlers learn about their world through a series of increasingly self-corrected ideas using a sophisticated form of hypothesis testing in order to extract information. It's a strategy very familiar to professional scientists. When researchers write grants, most have to write specific aims to test hypotheses. In that great collision between Karl Popper and Francis Bacon, as you know, you can divide the process into 4 steps. Number 1, you do a sensory observation. Say you see something novel from something that was actually not novel before. Number 2, you make an hypothesis about what you think is going on. Number 3, you do an experiment which can test the hypothesis. And number 4, you conclude something sensorially from it in an observation and maybe change your point of view as a result of what you see. Young children use a strategy to obtain information that is so similar to that strategy that Alison Gopnik, Andy Meltzoff, and Pat Kuhl wrote a book about it called Scientist in the Crib to describe it. How many of you have read Scientist in the Crib? Gets around a couple of them? 1 or 2? Let me give an example of this, and I'd like to give an example not from the book, but from my own family using Andy Meltzoff's powerful pioneering experiments in 1979. In 1979, it was thought for a long time that babies were a tabula rasa, and that you as a parent could... Am I going to get feedback if I go out here? I'm good? Okay. We're using a very interesting experiment. They thought that babies were a tabula rasa, and that you could, as a parent, paint your self-portrait inside your kids, and all would be well. This was done primarily by a bunch of overworked, burned-out scientists who did not have any children. Andy didn't buy it. Andy said, you know, I bet there's all kinds of preloaded software in babies. And I'll see if I can find one out. And he found one out that was a bombshell, that remains a bombshell in the field. This is what he did. He literally stuck his tongue out at a baby and then waited 45 seconds, saw something absolutely extraordinary. Some of you are familiar with this work. What did the baby do? Stuck its tongue right back out at Andy. Now, Andy had to wait a little bit. That's the interesting thing, because babies don't process the world like adults do. When he did, in fact, it looks a little bit, if you've ever seen those old videos of Joe Cocker at Woodstock, that's exactly what these babies look like. You stick your tongue out, bleh, and they go, bleh, and then they stick their tongues out. The reason why that's so extraordinary is for a single reason. The baby, he's measured it responsibly at 42 minutes of age, 42 minutes after the baby has been born. 42 minutes after age, the baby doesn't know it has a tongue, doesn't know you have a tongue. What's it seen for the last 9 months but a pink gauze, a heart that's beating, and a diaphragm going up and down 16 times a minute? That's all it's seen. Yet, right out of the box, it knows fully well it's got a tongue, you've got a tongue, and that if you respond to it in a very particular way, it will come right back at you, igniting a sequence of neurons that exist in the cerebellum, going right up to the prefrontal cortex, and goes bah. It rocks that world because it meant that babies had an information processing feature. Here from my own childhood, or from my own kids' childhood, Noah. Noah is now, regardless of what you see on the paper there, my kids are 9 and 7. It's an old paper, I think. Noah is now 7. Noah was a champion tongue sticker outer. Okay, he's born, and a half hour later, my poor wife, half hour later, I look over at Noah, and I just hold him, and I go, bleh. You have to do it slow. You got to get in their focal plane, but this can happen. Bleh. And he just comes right back at me. He goes, bleh. And by the end of the first week, we're going, bleh, 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 sticking our tongues back out at each other. This goes on. This is now 3 months. The kid's now 90 days old, and we've got this routine down. In fact, it's so routine, we put video cameras in so that we could gauge where the babies were even when they were asleep. And you could actually see Noah. My wife's footfall and my footfall are, to put it charitably, different. Noah could detect the footfall difference. And when he could detect me going into the crib, we could watch it on the monitor. You know what he starts to do? And by the time at 90 days, I had just finished giving, I'm part of the National Faculty for Continuing Medical Education and also retain an appointment at the University of Washington in the Department of Bioengineering. And giving lectures to scientific organizations, sometimes my wife would sit in the back. And in this one particular case, Noah comes, she's holding Noah. Noah's now 3 months old. And I'm just taking questions and the talk is over. And I'm holding Noah while I'm fielding questions. And out of the back of my eye, I see Noah do this every 5 seconds or so. What's he doing? Yeah, he's knocking on my door, isn't he? He's saying, can John come out and play? Or Dad come out and play? So I look down at him and I go, bleh, and he just lights up like a firecracker. Goes, bleh, 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 bleh. Now about every half a second. If I slow that down, you see this second brain rule that I am describing. If you slow down Noah's behavior, you see something absolutely extraordinary. Noah makes a sensory observation. The old man and I stick our tongues out at each other. Number 2, he makes an experiment. I'll bet he makes an hypothesis, actually, to deploy the experiment. The hypothesis was, I'll bet if I stick my tongue out at Dad, he will stick his tongue back out at me. And the experiment is what? He sticks his tongue out, and then he waits to see my response. He then makes an evaluation of the conclusion, because I did respond to him, and now he changes his behavior. Moving from every 5 seconds, now he's doing it about every half a second, like that. Nobody in the world taught Noah how to do that. Nobody in the world teaches babies how to do that, and they do it all over the world. They are natural explorers, powerful hypothesis testers. It's so sophisticated, we don't even have a good metaphor for the kinds of neurological machinery that have to be developed in order for that to happen. We know it has strong evolutionary roots. When we dropped out of the trees and got onto the Serengeti, we did not say to ourselves, my God, somebody give me a textbook and a classroom so I can learn about the Serengeti. What was selected for us was this. Here's the red snake with the white stripe. It bit me. I almost died yesterday. I hypothesized that if I see another snake with the red snake with the white stripe, the same thing is going to happen, so I'm going to stay away from it. It's part of a generalized understanding of information acquisition for little ones and even bigger ones. It's actually part of a larger idea, which has to do with what I like to call the brain's performance envelope. We don't know very much about how the brain works. Mike Gazzaniga is famous for saying, if we ever learn how a brain knows how to pick up a pencil, it'll represent a major achievement. I think Mike's an optimist. But we know a lot about its performance envelope. Here is the performance envelope of the human brain. It appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an unstable meteorological environment out of doors, and to do so in near constant motion. That's what it's good at. I'll say that again. The brain's performance envelope appears to be to solve problems related to surviving in an outdoor setting in an unstable meteorological environment, and to do so in near constant motion. The solve problems part is where you can insert this amazing exploratory hypothesis testing strategy. How might that relate to education? Well, if you were to design a system that functions in a fashion directly opposite to that performance envelope, you might come up with something very familiar to what we have now and what I am doing with you right now. You've sat there for more than an hour. In the Serengeti, you're not resting, you're lunch. I do a lot of work for Boeing, as Phil has intimated, and one of the metaphors I use is that it reminds me of this. You design this FA-18 fighter, Super Hornet, very powerful machine, very sophisticated machine, and all we allow it to do, is to taxi. That's fine. An FA-18 can taxi if you give it enough tires and enough gas. That's not what an FA-18 was built for. An F-18 was built to fly. What flying means is anybody's guess. What a system would look like if you deployed the performance envelope is an even bigger guess. Despite attempts to do exploratory learning, mostly with bigger kids, we still don't really know from the brain perspective, because brain scientists and education scientists don't get together very often. Nobody knows. But if they got together, what they came up with might engage the world of education outright, if not turn it on its head. Okay, I got about 5 minutes. My third and final example is the elementary crowd, now with kids taking classes. It has to do with this. The brain rule is, memory is not fixed at the moment of learning. Repetition of information in discretely timed intervals provides the fixative. By the time a kid is in first grade, all of those memory systems are very powerfully online, and they stay stable for the rest of the kid's life. I'll say that again. Memory is not fixed at the moment of learning. Repetition of information in discretely timed intervals provides the fixative. Memory is an extremely mysterious phenomenon. We actually don't know very much about it. I'd like to give you an example of how much we don't know by quoting a journalist who first heard Oliver Sacks speak. How many of you are familiar with Oliver Sacks and have read this marvelous tome, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, yeah? Okay, this journalist is talking to a psychiatrist who had just found out about one of the clinical cases in the book. Here's what he writes about. He's going to talk about something called Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff's is an inability to remember certain events past a certain point in time. These people test well in terms of IQ, math ability, language, and so on, and I first heard about it from a conversation I had with a psychiatrist. It was late 1995, and a man named George, a pleasant, white-haired looking fellow in his early 70s, came into the clinician's office. George was a World War II vet and was finally coming in to see the psychiatrist after years of begging from his wife. He started out telling the clinician about his war experiences. He had been an engineer, natural to be a communications specialist. The psychiatrist asked him about some specifics, which the patient cheerfully related. And then the psychiatrist asked George about his brother. Remember, this is a guy in his 70s. The patient said that his brother's name was Jimmy, who was 20. And was studying to be an accountant, recently engaged to a woman from Oregon named Lorraine. And that's when things seemed a little odd, because George was in his 70s with a brother at 20, and then George said the weirdest thing of all. This is what he said. Now that FDR is dead and Truman is at the helm, there's a lot to look forward to, isn't there, Doc? Psychiatrist got a knowing look on his face. He asked, George, what year is this? And that's when George said the strangest thing in the whole interview. 1945. George, how old are you? 23. George, pick up the Time magazine on the desk. You tell me the date. George went into shock and a temporary disorientation. Plainly a misprint, he mumbled as he read out August 1995. The psychiatrist got the contact information of his brother. Sure enough, man from Oregon, married a woman named Lorraine, but that had been 50 years ago. They had 3 children and several grandchildren by that time. It was the first, as the journalist is still speaking, this was the first time I had ever heard of Korsakoff's. In it, the person remains locked in time, has no ability to move forward. Nobody knows why it occurs, though in some cases it's associated with alcoholism and can be induced with severe deficiencies of vitamin B1. That's the weird world of memory. We don't know a lot about how memory works. There are so many types to date that there is no unified field theorem. One convenient way to study it, it's practically the only way to study it, is to look at categories of memory, and I will relate one that is relevant to education called declarative memory. It's a particular type of memory that says Eddie Van Halen is a guitarist. Here is a list of words, move on and so forth. When declarative information hits the brain, it goes through a series of stages before it takes its more permanent form. If you have 7 numbers, it will go into a buffer first. When the information first hits you, it will go into a buffer sometimes called immediate memory. That's Larry Squire's interpretation. And immediate memory, it will stay in your brain for 30 seconds, about 7 pieces of information, plus or minus 2. 30 seconds. If you don't repeat it, it goes away, vanishes, virtualizes. If you do repeat it, you can get it to go into another buffer, which is often called working memory, though some people classify the whole thing as working memory. There, it will stay in your brain for about 2 hours. If you don't repeat it again, you know what happens to it? It goes away again. But if you do repeat it, you can recruit it for long-term storage. And it's the long-term storage that is the goal for many educators, especially when one considers standardized tests. Forgive me. How much time do I have? Okay. Given that you can see this in elementary kids, even high schoolers, how does it relate to education? One is systemic. You have right now 6 one-hour periods of unrepeated information given in an unrelenting fire hose-like declarative stream. By the time you get to homework, you have not gone through the 30-second repetition. You've not gone through the 2-hour repetition. By the time you get to homework, which is 4 hours later, homework is not review. Homework is new learning. Why do we insist on this system? What if we did this? What if we broke each hour into 20-minute micro-units and then repeated those 20-minute units in an interleaved fashion like a leapfrog all day long, creating a massive repetition schedule based on the needs of working memory, repeating something every 90 minutes? Would you need homework? If you combined that with a powerful improvisatory toddler's exploratory instincts model, do you finally have a brain-friendly classroom? And would we finally learn our multiplication tables? In collaboration with some statisticians at the Hutch, the University of Washington, and SPU, we're actually doing an experiment just like this in the Bellevue School District, memorizing multiplication tables. The learning occurs once, then 90 minutes later, we repeat the lesson. The experiment is ongoing currently, and because these are blinded trials and also randomized, I don't want to say much. It's a small town. But the preliminary comments coming from the teachers are really interesting. At least in one case, one of the investigators has heard from the teachers who's in the experimental group and is getting the repetition where the teacher says, you know, the kids aren't any smarter than they were last year, but they sure seem stickier. Isn't that lovely? There you have it. An example of education science and brain science. Thank you very much.
We can't let John get away without at least one question. Okay.
What kind of simple exercises can you recommend for those of us who want to have better memory skills to use on an everyday basis?
Well, there's a lot out there, from Nintendo DS to Baby Einstein, suggesting some things. Most of it does not have a strong empirical basis. The empirical bases that do come along seem to suggest this. The more types of stress you have in your life, of the learned helplessness variety, where you have no control over the aversive stimulus and you have no control over the frequency of the stimulus, does more to damage people's ability to memorize than virtually anything else. Come along with that, when you are stressed like that, you either sleep too much or you don't get enough sleep. And when you knock on the doors of F33.1, major depression, that's a DSM-4A classification, it's major depression, you begin to collapse memory systems of all types. So it's really a funny thing to say. When you look at brain science seriously, you get really strange answers to practical questions like that. Because it suggests if you really want to become a better student, stop stressing over it. And it also suggests that if you are in a testing situation where stress is just powerfully on you, you are not testing somebody's native knowledge ability. You are actually testing their ability to work through their own stress.
Thank you, John. That was spectacular. Now you know why I needed some time off. I want to thank all of our program participants today, particularly Marie. Thank you, Marie. We're proud of you. And don't forget, Greg is going to and Dominic are going to be downstairs with tickets for the Young Artists Concerto Series, which brings us to this week's pretty good rule. Never hesitate to say, I don't know, or I need help, or I made a mistake, or I'm sorry. See you next week. We are adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org. And by First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.